The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden structures of Dustwater Gulch, turning the main street into a shimmering ribbon of heat and dust. It was the kind of day when sensible folk stayed indoors. But today was different. Today, Judge McGraw had promised entertainment, and in a town where excitement meant watching tumbleweeds roll past the saloon, people would endure any temperature for a spectacle. The courthouse, little more than a glorified shed with a tin roof, was packed shoulder to shoulder with sweaty men, all eager to see what the judge had cooked up this time. McGraw was notorious for his schemes, most of them designed to line his own pockets or provide him with amusement at others' expense. But this particular venture had captured the imagination of every bachelor within 100 miles. "Pick any wife for free," the flyers had proclaimed, plastered on every hitching post and saloon wall. "Come to Dustwater Gulch and claim your bride, no cost, no questions." It sounded too good to be true, and like most things that sounded too good to be true, it absolutely was. But desperation made men believe in miracles, especially lonely men in a territory where women were scarcer than water in August. Judge McGraw stood on a makeshift platform, his considerable belly straining against a vest that had seen better days. His face was red from heat and whiskey, and his eyes gleamed with the particular malice of a small man given too much power. Behind him stood a line of women, 6 in total, ranging from worn-out saloon girls to mail-order brides whose intended grooms had met unfortunate ends. They looked tired, resigned, like cattle at auction. "Gentlemen," McGraw's voice boomed across the room, "as promised, we have here a fine selection of ladies, all willing and eager to become wives to upstanding citizens of our fair territory." He gestured dramatically. "All you need is a homestead claim and your word as a gentleman. The territory needs families, and by God, we'll make families." The crowd cheered, though several of the women flinched at the enthusiasm. This wasn't romance. It was commerce dressed up in pretty words. "But wait!" McGraw raised a meaty hand. "We have one more arrival, a special case, you might say, brought in from Wyoming Territory just this morning." The back door of the courthouse crashed open, and 2 deputies struggled to maneuver someone through the frame. At first, the crowd couldn't comprehend what they were seeing. Then, as the figure straightened to full height, a collective gasp rippled through the room. She was enormous. Eleanor Whitlock, Ellie to anyone brave enough to befriend her, stood well over 7 feet tall. Her shoulders were broader than most men's, her arms thick with muscle earned through years of hard labor. She wore a simple cotton dress that had been hastily altered to fit her frame, and her wrists were bound with rope. Her face was striking. High cheekbones, strong jaw, eyes the color of storm clouds, but it was a face that inspired fear rather than admiration in most who saw it. The room erupted in a mixture of laughter, gasps, and crude comments. Men pointed and elbowed each other, making jokes loud enough for her to hear. Ellie's face remained impassive, though her jaw tightened with each insult. She'd heard them all before. "This here is Eleanor Whitlock," McGraw announced, barely containing his glee. "Charged with assault and destruction of property at a gambling house in Cheyenne, broke 3 men's arms and caused $200 in damages." He paused for effect. "But I convinced the Wyoming marshal to release her into territorial custody on the condition that she be domesticated." More laughter, more pointing. "Now, I know what you're thinking," McGraw continued, walking around Ellie like a ringmaster presenting an exotic animal. Who would want such a specimen? But think of it, gentlemen, a wife who could plow a field single-handed, pull a wagon, fight off rustlers. Why, she's practically 2 wives for the price of— He paused dramatically. Absolutely nothing. The crowd roared with amusement, but no one stepped forward. McGraw's smile widened. In fact, I like her so much. He pulled out a marriage certificate with a flourish. I'll take the giant bride myself. Consider it a civic duty. Someone has to tame this wild creature, and who better than the law itself? His eyes traveled over Ellie with undisguised cruelty. This wasn't about marriage. It was about ownership, about having a curiosity to display, a beast to break. The other women on the platform looked away, grateful they weren't in her position. Ellie's hands curled into fists, the rope digging into her wrists. She'd been through hell before, but this particular brand of humiliation cut deeper than she expected, not because she cared what McGraw thought, but because, after 32 years of being treated like a monster, she'd almost convinced herself she could be seen as human. Almost. Any objections? McGraw pulled out a pen with theatrical flair. Speak now, or forever. Judge. The voice was quiet, barely audible over the crowd's chatter, but something in its tone made people turn. It came from the back corner of the room, from a man so still he'd seemed part of the wall itself. Don Hayes pushed himself upright with visible effort. He was tall, or had been, before illness and injury had hunched his shoulders and hollowed his cheeks. His clothes hung loose on a frame that had once been powerful, and his face bore the deep lines of a man who'd seen 53 hard years. His right arm was bound in a crude sling, and blood had seeped through the bandage, staining it rust red. He looked like death warmed over, and everyone knew it. The hell you want, Hayes? McGraw's jovial mask slipped, revealing irritation. You're supposed to be home dying quietly. Not dead yet, Don replied, taking a step forward. His legs trembled, but he kept moving. You said any man could choose, that the offer was free. Well, yes, but then I choose her. Don's eyes met Ellie's across the room. I choose the lady in the back. Silence descended like a hammer blow. Then McGraw's laugh exploded, genuine and cruel. You? You want the giant? He slapped his thigh. Hayes, you can barely stand. What makes you think you can handle a woman who could snap you like kindling? I'm not looking to handle anybody, Don said, his voice steady despite his obvious weakness. Just offering her a choice that doesn't involve being your entertainment. The insult landed, and McGraw's face darkened. You've got nothing to offer a wife. Your land's worthless. You're dying. What's your plan here, old man? Marry her so she can bury you next week? Maybe. Don had reached the front of the room now, swaying slightly. But at least she'd get to choose what happens after that. Can't say the same if she goes with you. Ellie stared at this scarecrow of a man who could barely stand, who looked like a strong wind would blow him over, who was choosing to face down the most powerful man in the territory. For her. A stranger. A freak. Why? McGraw's eyes narrowed. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone everyone expected to be dead within the month. But he was also a showman, and he could feel the crowd's attention shifting, their curiosity piqued by this unexpected development. Tell you what, McGraw said slowly, a new plan forming behind his eyes. You want her? Fine, take her. But there's conditions. He pulled out a fresh certificate. You marry her right now, legal and binding, no annulment, no divorce. And when you die, which will be soon, she comes back to me as your widow. Deal?" It was a trap, and everyone knew it. McGraw would get his prize in the end, and he'd have the added satisfaction of watching Hayes struggle and fail first. Don didn't hesitate. "Deal, but I'll need the lady's consent." All eyes turned to Ellie. She'd been so silent they'd almost forgotten she had a voice. Her throat was dry, her mind racing. This man, this dying stranger, was offering her something no one else ever had. A choice. Not a good choice, perhaps. Marriage to a man who might not survive the week, followed by becoming McGraw's property anyway. But it bought her time, and time, she'd learned, could change everything. "Yes," she said, her voice deeper than most men's but clear and firm. "I consent." McGraw's smile was victorious. He'd get his entertainment either way, watching Hayes try to survive with this impossible wife or claiming her as widow when he inevitably failed. Excellent. "Deputy, draw up the certificate. Make it official." The ceremony was perfunctory and brutal in its efficiency. No vows of love, no promises of cherishing. Just names on paper, signatures witnessed, and the pronouncement, "man and wife under territorial law." When it was done, McGraw gestured dismissively. "Get her out of here, and Hayes, don't die too quick. I want to see you try." The deputies untied Ellie's wrists, leaving raw marks where the rope had bitten. She rubbed them absently, still processing what had just happened. She was married to a stranger, a dying stranger who'd chosen her for reasons she couldn't fathom. Don turned toward the door, and immediately his legs buckled. He would have hit the floor if Ellie hadn't moved with surprising speed, catching him with one massive hand. She steadied him as easily as she might steady a child. "Can you walk?" she asked quietly. "Have to," he replied through gritted teeth. "My horse is outside." "Where do you live?" "West Ridge. 3 miles." 3 miles. In the baking sun, with a man who could barely stand. Ellie looked at the crowd still watching them with a mixture of pity and amusement, at McGraw's satisfied smirk, at the other women who seemed relieved it wasn't them. "I'll carry you," she said simply. "The hell you will," Don protested, but his body betrayed him, another wave of weakness making him sag against her support. "I'm strong enough. You're light enough. And I don't think you'll make it otherwise." She paused. "Unless you'd rather die here, giving them a better show." That decided it. Don's pride was considerable, but not suicidal. "The horse can find the way home. Just don't drop me." "Haven't dropped anything yet," Ellie replied, and before he could protest further, she'd scooped him up. One arm under his knees, the other supporting his back, carrying him like he weighed nothing at all. The crowd parted as she walked through, their laughter following them out into the brutal sunlight. Don's horse, a tired gray mare, nickered in recognition. Ellie managed to mount while holding Don, settling him in front of her, his back against her chest. She could feel his heart racing, whether from fever or humiliation she couldn't tell. "Which way?" she asked. "West," he managed. "Follow the ridge line." They rode in silence through the heat, leaving Dustwater Gulch and its cruel entertainment behind. The land stretched out endlessly in all directions. Red rock and scrub brush, the occasional twisted juniper clinging to life in impossible places. It was beautiful in its harshness and completely unforgiving. Don's breathing grew more labored as they rode. Ellie could feel the heat radiating from him, Fever, not just from the sun. His wound was infected. She could smell it even over the dust and horse sweat. He needed medicine, clean water, rest, things she wasn't sure they'd find at the end of this ride. Why did you do it? The question escaped before she could stop it. Don was quiet for so long she thought he might have passed out. Then, seen a lot of things in my life, done things I'm not proud of, but watching a man treat a woman like property, like a joke. He coughed, the sound wet and painful. Couldn't abide it, not and still call myself a man. You don't know me? No, but I know McGraw, and I know what happens to people he owns. Don shifted slightly, trying to ease pressure on his wound. Figure even a few days of freedom's better than a lifetime as his curiosity. Even if those few days kill you? Ma'am, Ellie, I was dying anyway. Least this way I'll die having done one decent thing. Ellie had no response to that. She focused on keeping the horse moving, on following the ridge line, on not thinking about the fact that she was now legally bound to a man who might not survive the night. The cabin appeared as the sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert. It was small, tiny really, built of weathered wood and adobe, with a sagging porch and a roof that had seen better years. But it was shelter, and right now that was more than enough. Ellie dismounted carefully, lifting Don down and carrying him inside. The interior was dark, hot, and thick with dust. A single room with a stove, a table, a chair, and a narrow bed against one wall. It smelled of old smoke and loneliness. She laid Don on the bed as gently as she could. His eyes were glassy with fever now, his skin burning to the touch. When she unbuttoned his shirt to check the wound, she had to suppress a gasp. The bullet hole in his shoulder was angry and inflamed, red lines radiating outward, blood poisoning spreading toward his heart. "There's a well out back," Don mumbled. "Water might still be good, and some whiskey under the floorboard by the stove. You'll need it to clean." He didn't finish. Consciousness slipped away from him like sand through fingers. Ellie stood in the dim cabin, looking at this stranger who was now her husband, at the wound that was slowly killing him, at the poverty and isolation that surrounded them. She thought about McGraw's laughing face, about the crowd's mockery, about her own life of being feared and reviled wherever she went. Then she rolled up her sleeves. She'd been called a lot of things in her 32 years, monster, freak, abomination. But she'd also been called something else, though rarely, survivor. And if there was one thing Eleanor Whitlock knew how to do, it was survive. The well water was indeed good, cold and clear from some deep spring. She hauled up bucket after bucket, heating some on the stove, keeping others cold. She found the whiskey, cheap rot gut that would burn like hellfire but would clean a wound. She tore apart one of the few clean shirts she found in the trunk, making bandages. Then she set to work. Cleaning the wound was brutal. Even unconscious, Don groaned and thrashed as she poured whiskey into the infection, scrubbing away dead tissue with cloth and determination. Twice she had to stop and hold him down with her considerable strength to keep him from hurting himself further. The stench of infected flesh filled the small cabin, and Ellie breathed through her mouth, focusing on the task. When the wound was finally clean, she packed it with clean cloth and bound it tight. Then she stripped Don of his sweat-soaked clothes and sponged him down with cool water, trying to bring down the fever that was cooking him from the inside. It took hours. By the time she finished, night had fallen completely, and Ellie herself was exhausted. She found some jerky in a tin and forced herself to eat, though she had no appetite. She checked on the horse, giving her water and what little grain was left in a barrel. Then she returned to the cabin and sat in the single chair, watching Don breathe, counting each breath like a prayer. He'd saved her from McGraw. Now she'd save him from death, if she could. The night stretched long and fever dark. Don thrashed and muttered, caught in nightmares Ellie couldn't see. She stayed awake, changing his bandages when they soaked through, cooling him with water when the fever spiked, holding him down when his movements threatened to tear open the wound. Somewhere around 3 a.m, he opened his eyes. Truly, opened them. Not the glassy stare of fever, but actual awareness. "You're still here," he whispered, his voice like gravel. "Where else would I be?" "Thought maybe you'd take the horse, head somewhere better." Ellie shook her head. "Made a deal, signed papers. Besides," she hesitated, "you stood up for me. Can't remember the last time anyone did that." Don tried to smile, but it came out as more of a grimace. "Well, don't get used to it. I'm not exactly known for my heroics." He paused, gathering strength. "What happened to them? The men whose arms you broke?" "They grabbed me, put their hands where they shouldn't." Her voice hardened. "So I broke their arms. All of them thought being bigger meant they could do what they wanted. Found out different. Good. Judge didn't think so. Judge is a pig who'd sell his own mother for $1 and a laugh." Don's eyes drifted closed again. "Thank you for not letting me die yet." "Day's not over," Ellie replied, but he'd already slipped back into sleep. Real sleep this time, not fever dreams. She allowed herself a small breath of relief. He was fighting. That was something. The days that followed established a rhythm. Ellie would rise with the sun, tend to Don's wound, feed him broth when he could stomach it, water when he couldn't. Then she'd tackle the seemingly endless list of tasks the homestead required, hauling water, feeding the horse, gathering what little food she could find in the surrounding desert, roots, the occasional rabbit, dried berries from bushes that somehow survived the heat. The cabin itself was a disaster. Years of bachelor living had turned it into something approaching a cave. Ellie cleaned, swept, scrubbed, organized. She found a needle and thread and repaired the holes in the roof where rain would come through. She reinforced the door frame, which had been coming loose. She cleared brush away from the cabin walls, reducing the fire risk. She worked with the steady determination of someone who'd never been afraid of hard labor, and the cabin slowly transformed from a dying man's tomb into something approaching a home. Don improved slowly, his body fighting off the infection with stubborn persistence. After a week, he could sit up without help. After 2, he could walk to the door and back without collapsing. After 3, he insisted on doing small tasks, peeling vegetables, mending tack, anything to feel useful. They talked during those long days. Not constantly. Both were comfortable with silence, but enough to learn each other's stories. Don had been married before, he told her one evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in shades of orange and red. His wife Sarah and their daughter Emily had died of fever 15 years ago, and he'd never quite recovered. He'd become a cowboy because it required nothing of him except the ability to ride and work, and neither of those required a heart. "I built this place for them," he said, his voice distant, "was going to expand it, make it proper. Then they died, and I just stopped planning, stopped hoping, just existing day to day until existing became too much trouble. Ellie listened without judgment. She understood stopping, understood hopelessness, understood the weight of simply existing in a world that didn't want you. She told him about her own life, or the parts she could bear to share. Born in New York to parents who'd loved her but hadn't known what to do with a daughter who outgrew her father by age 12 and her mother by 13. The constant stares, the whispered comments, the boys who'd challenged her to fights and then cried when she won. The jobs she'd lost because people found her unsettling. The lonely westward journey, thinking maybe the frontier would have room for someone like her. Turns out, she said with bitter humor, even the Wild West has standards. Don watched her in the fading light, this woman who could break men with her bare hands, but who handled his fever-weak body with infinite gentleness. You're not what they think you are? What am I, then? He considered. Stronger than you should have to be, kinder than you've got any reason to be, and probably the best thing that's happened to me in 15 years. Ellie felt heat rise in her face that had nothing to do with the desert sun. She wasn't used to compliments, wasn't sure how to receive them. So she deflected. You're the one who saved me from McGraw. You saved me from dying, call it even. But it wasn't even, and they both knew it. Something was growing between them in that isolated cabin. Something neither had expected when they'd signed those papers in Dustwater Gulch. It was fragile and tentative, like a desert flower after rain, unsure if it would be allowed to bloom or if it would be crushed before it could. A month after their unconventional wedding, Don was well enough to work. Not hard work. His shoulder would never be quite right again, but enough to help. They established a partnership, dividing tasks according to strength and ability. Ellie handled anything requiring physical power, while Don managed anything requiring local knowledge or skill. Together, they began to make the homestead viable. They expanded the vegetable garden, nursing crops from the reluctant soil with careful irrigation from the well. They repaired the chicken coop and bought 6 hens from a neighboring homesteader, giving them eggs. Don taught Ellie to shoot, and she proved a natural, her steady hands and sharp eyes making her a better marksman than he'd ever been. The cabin began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a home. Ellie added small touches, wildflowers in a tin cup, a blanket she'd woven from scrap wool, curtains for the single window. Don built her a chair sized for her frame, working slowly and carefully to get the proportions right. They learned each other's rhythms, each other's silences. Don would read aloud in the evenings. He had a small collection of books, treasured survivors of his earlier life, while Ellie worked on mending or cooking. She had a surprisingly good singing voice, deep and rich, and sometimes at night he'd hear her humming old songs, turning the cabin into something almost magical. They were careful with each other, respectful of boundaries, aware that their marriage was built on necessity rather than romance. They shared the cabin, but not the bed. Ellie slept on blankets on the floor, refusing Don's offers to take turns despite the fact that she barely fit in the small space. There was no physical intimacy beyond the occasional brush of hands, the careful touch of Ellie checking Don's wound, the comfortable proximity of two people sharing close quarters. But emotional intimacy was another matter. That grew despite their caution, fed by shared work and shared silences. by the simple fact of being seen and accepted for what they actually were, rather than what others thought they should be. It was Ellie who first acknowledged it. One evening, 2 months into their marriage, they were sitting on the porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky, when she said quietly, "I don't want to go back to McGraw when you die." Don turned to look at her. "I'm not planning on dying any time soon. But when you do, the agreement was made by a desperate man trying to save a woman from humiliation. Doesn't mean I have to honor the spirit of it." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking. The homestead's in my name, but I could add yours. That way, when I die, it becomes yours. McGraw can't touch it, can't touch you." "Why would you do that?" "Because you're my wife. Not on paper only, but in truth. Maybe not the way either of us expected, but—" He struggled for words. "You matter, Ellie. You matter to me. And I'll be damned if I let McGraw get his claws into you just because my heart stops beating." Ellie felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking, but opening, like ice thawing after a long winter. "Don, I know it's not a real marriage," he continued, misunderstanding her hesitation. "I know you didn't choose this, not really. But you've given me something I thought I'd lost forever. You've given me a reason to wake up in the morning, a reason to work, a reason to—" He stopped, then finished simply. "A reason." "It feels real to me," Ellie said quietly. "This, us, the life we're building, it feels more real than anything I've ever had." They sat in silence after that, but it was a different kind of silence, charged, hopeful. The space between them seemed both infinite and infinitesimal, a gap neither knew quite how to cross, but both wanted to. Don reached out slowly, giving her time to move away if she wanted. When she didn't, his scarred hand found hers, fingers intertwining with surprising ease. They sat like that until the stars filled the sky completely, holding hands like teenagers, marveling at the simple miracle of human connection. The trouble came, as trouble always does, when things were starting to feel safe. It was early October when the riders appeared on the horizon, 5 men on horseback, moving with the lazy confidence of people who expected no resistance. Don spotted them first, his hand automatically going to the rifle they kept by the door. "Ellie," he called, "we've got company." She emerged from the garden, dirt on her hands, and followed his gaze. Something in the way the men rode made her tense. This wasn't a social call. The riders pulled up in front of the cabin, their leader, a man with a scar running from temple to jaw, looking over the homestead with calculating eyes. He was flanked by 4 others, all hard men with the look of violence about them. "Well now," Scarface said, his voice like gravel rolling downhill. "Heard there was a homestead out here, but didn't believe it. Thought the old cowboy had finally up and died." "Not dead," Don replied evenly. "Not interested in visitors either. You're welcome to water your horses and move on." "That's real generous." The man's eyes found Ellie, and his expression shifted from calculation to something uglier. "That the giant girl, the one McGraw's been telling stories about?" "That's my wife," Don said, his voice hardening, "and you'd best remember your manners." "Wife," Scarface laughed. "Heard about that, too. Heard you married her to spite McGraw, then brought her out here to die slow with you. That true?" "What's true is you're trespassing. State your business or get gone." The man's smile faded. "See, here's the thing, Hayes. This is Garrett land. Always has been. You've been squatting here for years, and we've let it slide because You're pathetic and dying. But now you've got help. Might make something of this place. That changes things." Don's knuckles whitened on the rifle. "I filed proper claim on this land 6 years ago. It's mine, legal and registered. Papers can burn. Claims can be disputed, especially when there's no one around to argue about it." Garrett leaned forward in his saddle. "So, here's the deal. You sign this land over to me, I'll let you both walk away. The giant can even keep her virtue if that matters to a freak like her. You refuse, well," he gestured to his men, "accidents happen. Lot of accidents out here in the desert." Ellie had been silent up to now, but she moved forward, stepping beside Don. Standing at her full height, she was nearly as tall as the mounted men and far more imposing. "The answer is no." Garrett's hand drifted toward his gun. "Wasn't asking you, freak." "She speaks for both of us," Don said. "The answer is no. This is our land. We're staying." "Your funeral." Garrett smiled coldly. "Boys, I think we need to show these folks how we handle squatters." What happened next happened fast. Garrett's hand went for his gun, but Ellie was faster. She grabbed a shovel leaning against the porch rail and swung it like a club, catching Garrett's horse in the shoulder. The animal screamed and reared, throwing its rider. The other men reached for their weapons, but Don had already brought the rifle up, firing a warning shot over their heads. "Next one's not a warning," he shouted. 2 of the men spurred their horses forward. Ellie met the first with the shovel, catching the horse's legs and sending both horse and rider tumbling. The second pulled his gun, and Ellie felt the bullet sear past her ear, close enough to feel the heat. Then she was on him, dragging him from his saddle with one massive hand, throwing him to the ground with enough force to knock the wind from his lungs. His gun fell from nerveless fingers. The remaining 2 riders wheeled their horses, trying to flank Don, but he'd been in range wars before. He fired once, hitting one man in the leg. The man screamed and nearly fell, barely managing to stay in the saddle. The other raised his hands in surrender. It was over in less than a minute. Garrett staggered to his feet, his face twisted with rage and fear. "You're dead! Both of you! I'll bring back 20 men, 50. I'll burn this place to the ground with you in it." "You do that, I'll send word to the territorial marshal about your cattle rustling operation," Don replied calmly. "I've seen your boys rebranding stock. Got witnesses who'll testify. You bring a war to my door, I'll bring the law to yours." It was a bluff, mostly, but Garrett's face suggested it hit close to truth. The rancher mounted his horse with difficulty, gathering his men. "This isn't over." "It is for today." Don kept the rifle trained on them. "Get gone." They rode off, 3 of them wounded, all of them humiliated. Don and Ellie watched them disappear over the ridge, then looked at each other. "They'll be back," Ellie said quietly. "Probably." Don lowered the rifle, his hand shaking now that the crisis had passed. "But not today, maybe not tomorrow, and in the meantime, we're still here." Ellie knelt to retrieve the fallen guns, making sure they weren't leaving weapons behind. "You knew about the rustling?" "Suspected. Never had proof, never cared enough to look. But men like Garrett always have something to hide." He smiled grimly. "Now we've just got to hope that something is bad enough to keep him cautious." That night, they reinforced the cabin's defenses. Don showed Ellie how to build shooting positions, how to cover approaches, how to turn their small homestead into something approaching a fortress. They worked in grim silence, both understanding that their peaceful interlude had ended. "I'm sorry," Don said as they finished. "I brought you into this. If you'd stayed in Dustwater Gulch, you wouldn't be facing— I'd be facing McGraw, Ellie interrupted. At least here, I'm facing it with someone who sees me as human. She touched his arm gently. Don't apologize for giving me that. The attack came 3 nights later. Ellie woke to the smell of smoke. She was on her feet instantly, shaking Don awake. Fire! They burst from the cabin to find flames licking at the chicken coop and the stable where the horse was kept. Dark figures moved in the darkness. Garrett's men, more of them this time, torches in hand. Don grabbed the rifle, but Ellie was already moving. She ran toward the stable, her long strides eating up ground. A man stepped into her path, swinging a torch at her face. She caught his wrist, twisted, and sent him sprawling. The torch flew into empty air. She reached the stable as flames began spreading up the walls. The horse inside was screaming in terror. Ellie grabbed the door, hot enough to burn, but she didn't care, and wrenched it open. The horse burst out, nearly trampling her in its panic. Behind her, she heard shots. Don was firing methodically, driving back the men trying to approach the cabin, but there were too many, and they were spreading out, trying to surround the homestead. Ellie grabbed a bucket and ran for the well. The first bucket of water she threw on the stable barely made a dent in the flames, but she kept going, a one-woman bucket brigade, hauling and throwing with desperate strength. The fire was spreading faster than she could douse it. A bullet kicked up dirt near her feet. She turned to see Garrett himself, gun raised, his face demonic in the firelight. Should have taken the deal, freak. He fired again, and this time the bullet caught her. A burning line across her ribs, painful, but not deep. Ellie roared in rage and charged. Garrett got off one more shot, Wild missing completely, before she reached him. She didn't break his bones. She wanted to. God, she wanted to. But she had enough presence of mind left to simply disarm him, throwing his gun far into the darkness and then knocking him unconscious with a single punch. He crumpled like a puppet with cut strings. Don's voice cut through the chaos. "Ellie, behind you!" She spun to see 2 men rushing her, clubs raised. She caught the first club mid-swing, yanking it from the man's grasp and using it to sweep the second man's legs. They both went down, but more were coming. She could see them at the edges of firelight, 8 or 9 at least, all armed. They'd underestimated her once. They wouldn't make that mistake again. Then, impossibly, she heard other voices, new voices. She turned to see riders cresting the ridge. Not Garrett's men, but homesteaders, neighbors she'd barely met. People Don had helped over the years, people who'd heard the shots and seen the flames and come to investigate. "Hayes, need help?" "Could use it," Don shouted back. The tide turned. Garrett's men, faced with superior numbers and no element of surprise, broke and ran. A few of the homesteaders gave chase, but most stayed to help fight the fire, forming bucket lines, beating out flames with blankets and shovels. It took hours, but they saved most of the homestead. The chicken coop was a total loss, and the stable was damaged but repairable. The cabin itself was untouched. As dawn broke, Ellie sat on the porch, her burns being tended by a neighboring woman while Don talked with the homesteaders. The bullet wound in her side was superficial, painful, but clean. She'd had worse. "You gave them a hell of a fight," the woman said admiringly. She was small and weathered, probably in her 50s. "Saw you take on 3 men at once. Never seen anything like it." "Had to," Ellie replied simply. "They were trying to burn our home." "Your home?" The woman smiled. That's good. Good you found a place. Don's a good man. Deserves someone to share his life with, especially after—" She trailed off, then continued. "Anyway, you're one of us now. Anyone messes with you, they mess with all of us." Ellie felt her throat tighten. One of us. She'd never been one of anything, anywhere. Always the outsider, the freak, the monster. And here, in the middle of the Arizona desert, she was suddenly part of a community. Don approached as the last of the homesteaders prepared to leave. His face was exhausted, but satisfied. "They're putting together a group to ride into Dustwater Gulch tomorrow. Going to report Garrett to the marshal, show our injuries as evidence. Between that and the rustling allegations, he'll be lucky if he just gets run out of the territory." "And if he comes back?" "He won't." Don sat beside her carefully. "He's finished. Everyone knows it now. He picked a fight with the wrong people." Ellie looked at him, this man who'd saved her from humiliation, who'd given her a home, who'd just fought off armed men to protect what they'd built together. "I shot him," she said quietly. "In the confusion, I shot him." "I know." Don's voice was gentle. "I saw. I killed him. You defended our home. There's a difference." He took her hand. "Ellie, I've killed before. In the war, after, in range disputes. It never sits easy, but sometimes it's necessary. Sometimes it's you or them, and you've got to choose yourself. That's what you did. You chose us." "I don't regret it," she admitted. "That's what scares me. I don't regret it at all." "Then don't. Regret is for when you have a choice. You didn't. None of us did." He squeezed her hand. "Come on. Let's get you cleaned up properly and see about getting some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be another long day." In the aftermath of the raid, word spread through the territory about the giant bride of Dustwater Gulch. But the story that spread wasn't what McGraw had hoped for. It wasn't about a freak or a curiosity. It was about a woman who defended her home against overwhelming odds, who'd saved her husband and their livelihood with courage and strength. Homesteaders began stopping by, some to offer help, others simply to meet the legendary woman. Ellie was uncomfortable with the attention at first, but Don pointed out that this was something new. Admiration, not mockery. Fear earned through respect, not horror. The territorial marshal came by 3 weeks later, a tired man with honest eyes. He interviewed them both, examined the remains of the fire, talked to the neighbors. Then he arrested Garrett, who'd survived his wounds, but not his reputation. The rancher would face trial in Tucson for arson, attempted murder, and cattle rustling. His gang had scattered, and his lands were being auctioned to pay debts. "You two caused quite a stir," the marshal said as he prepared to leave. "Even heard about it in Phoenix. The dying cowboy and the giant bride, they're calling it. Like something out of a dime novel." "We're just trying to live," Ellie said. "Well, keep living like this and you'll be heroes." He tipped his hat. "For what it's worth, ma'am, my wife's been giving me hell about not standing up to injustice more often. Says if a giant woman can fight off a dozen armed men, the least I can do is enforce the law properly. So thanks for that." After he left, Ellie and Don stood together on their porch, looking out at the land they'd defended. The stable was repaired, better than before. They'd bought new chickens. The crops were still growing. Life continued. "Heroes," Ellie mused. "That's a new one." "Better than what they used to call you?" "Anything's better than that." She was quiet for a moment. "Don, when you asked me to marry you—" "I didn't ask. I volunteered. There's a difference. Fine. When you volunteered to marry me, did you think it would turn into this? She gestured at the homestead, at the life they'd built. Don considered. Honestly, I thought I'd be dead by now. Thought I'd buy you a few days of freedom and then exit quietly. But you, he shook his head in wonder, you made me want to live, made me remember what it felt like to have something worth fighting for. So no, I didn't think it would turn into this, but I'm grateful it did. So am I. Ellie turned to face him fully. Don, I need to tell you something. Go ahead. I love you. The words came out simply, without drama, just truth stated plainly. I don't know when it happened. Maybe that first day when you stood up to McGraw. Maybe later when you built me that chair. But somewhere along the way, this stopped being about survival and started being about us. About wanting to build a life with you, not just exist alongside you. Don's eyes glistened suspiciously. Ellie Whitlock Hayes, are you proposing to your own husband? I'm telling my husband that this marriage is real. For me, all of it. And asking if... She faltered, vulnerable in a way that fighting armed men had never made her. If it could be real for you, too. Instead of answering with words, Don stood on his toes. Even with her sitting, she was nearly his height, and kissed her. It was gentle and tentative, asking permission even as it was given, and Ellie felt something fundamental shift inside her. She'd been touched before, grabbed and pawed and hurt, but never kissed, never touched with tenderness. When they finally pulled apart, Don's smile was tremulous but genuine. I love you too. Probably have since you carried me home like I weighed nothing, refusing to let me die in the dust. You saved my life, Ellie, not just physically. You saved the part of me that wanted to live. We saved each other, she corrected. Fair enough. That night, for the first time, they shared the bed. Not for passion, though that would come later, but simply to be close, to feel the warmth and reality of another person choosing to be there. Ellie fit awkwardly in the small space, but Don didn't care, and neither did she. They lay together, hands intertwined, hearts beating in tandem, two unlikely souls who'd found each other in the harshest of places and built something beautiful from the wreckage. 3 months later, Judge McGraw made his final play. He arrived at the homestead with 2 deputies and a smug expression, carrying official-looking documents. Hayes, I'm here to collect on our agreement. Don emerged from the cabin, Ellie beside him. They were expecting this. They'd prepared for it. What agreement would that be, Judge? Don asked mildly. Don't play games with me. When you die, she reverts to my custody. It's in the marriage certificate. McGraw waved the papers. Well, I've had the territorial doctor examine you, and he says you've got consumption, 6 months at most. So I'm here to take possession early, save everyone the trouble of... I'm not dead, Don interrupted. Technically, but... And the homestead is jointly owned. Filed the papers 2 months ago. Check with the land office if you don't believe me. Don pulled out his own documents. Which means, even if I die tomorrow, Ellie inherits everything. Including the debt you owe us for damages from the fire. Yes, we know you backed Garrett financially, and we've got statements from his men implicating you. McGraw's face went purple. You can't prove. The territorial marshal thinks we can. He's very interested in talking to you, actually. Something about corruption charges. Don's smile was cold. You want to take Ellie? You'll have to go through the law. And given your reputation right now, I don't think the law's inclined to help." The judge sputtered, threatened, blustered, but in the end, he left empty-handed. The deputies looked almost relieved. Neither had wanted to try forcing Ellie to do anything against her will. As McGraw's wagon disappeared down the trail, Ellie let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. Is it really over? The legal part? Yes, he can't touch you now. No one can. Don took her hand. But the better question is, what do we do now? What do you mean? I mean, we've spent these months fighting to survive, to keep this place, to stay alive. Now we've won. The land is ours. We're safe. We're together. So, he looked at her seriously. What kind of life do you want to build? Ellie looked around at their homestead, at the cabin they'd repaired together, at the land they'd defended, at the life they'd carved from harsh earth and harsher circumstance. She thought about the community that had come to accept her, the man who'd chosen to see her humanity, the future that stretched ahead like the desert itself, vast, challenging, but full of possibility. I want to expand, she said finally. The cabin. Make it bigger. Maybe add a second room. And I want to help the other homesteaders, the ones struggling, use my strength for something good. She paused. And I want to grow old with you, however long that takes. Don smiled, the first truly peaceful expression she'd seen on his face. That sounds like a fine life to me. They stood together on their porch, watching the sun set over land that was truly theirs, bound not by papers or necessity, but by something deeper, choice. They'd chosen each other in a moment of desperation, and they chose each other again every day after, building a love as enduring as the desert itself. In Dustwater Gulch, they still told stories about the giant bride, but now the stories spoke of courage, of loyalty, of a woman who'd turned humiliation into honor and created a home from nothing. Children whispered her name with awe rather than fear. Women spoke of her with admiration, and men who'd once mocked her now tipped their hats when she rode into town. As for Eleanor and Don Hayes, they built their life one day at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of love at a time. The cabin grew larger, the homestead prospered. Don's health, bolstered by purpose and care, lasted far longer than any doctor predicted. And Ellie, the giant bride who was never meant to be loved, found herself loved deeply and truly by a man who saw past size and strength to the heart beneath. Years later, when travelers asked how they'd built such a successful homestead in such unforgiving land, their answer was always the same. We saved each other. The rest was just details. And that, more than any dime novel tale or exaggerated legend, was the truth of the giant bride of Dustwater Gulch.